Hi everyone, welcome to the first session of the Safety Nights Heat Safety Summit. Before we get started, I just want to go over some quick housekeeping items, and then we'll jump right in. So first, if you haven't registered your email, please make sure you've registered your email. Apparently, until you do that, you won't be able to use the chat or any of the other features. So you should have received an email from Crowdcast asking to verify if you haven't already done that. Two, if you have any questions that you might want to ask Drew at any point during the session, you'll notice on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a Q&A button. It's a question mark icon. If you click that, feel free to toss your questions in there. And if you see a question in there that you also want to ask, you do have the ability to upvote that question to let us know how important that question is to you and how many other people, to allow us to address that in a more efficient manner. So you'll see next to the question, there'll be an up button. Feel free to click that at any point in time if that question resonates with you. Lastly, if you have any questions about the summit as a whole, feel free. You can email me at any point in time. I'm going to toss my email right here in the chat. And again, as the session's going on, if you have any questions, feel free to also toss those in the chat, and I'll do my best to address those accordingly. So now, without further ado, I'll stop talking and turn the stage over to the person that you all came here to see. Drew, the stage is all yours.
All right, appreciate it, Dan. Thanks everybody taking the time to jump on this Heat Safety Summit. We'll pull the slides up here and we'll get started. So I know we've been talking in the chat, kind of seeing where everybody's from. I'll pull a poll up here in a minute to kind of see what kind of work environment that you are dealing with. But as Dan mentioned, feel free to type questions in the question portion of the platform. And if you think about something later, feel free to, I'll have my contact information in there. You can reach out to me directly either way, and we'll get you taken care of. But overall, we're going to talk about managing the heat stress under OSHA's proposed heat injury and illness prevention rule. So if you've been whether you've been tracking this standard or rule, or whether you're brand new to it and kind of just catching on to the rulemaking process, we'll kind of lay the groundwork of where OSHA is right now, and talk about what they're proposed. And so, kind of I guess, disclaimer to all this is it is a proposed rule, and they have closed the public comment portion of their rulemaking process. And so, but some things may change slightly from the proposed rule. So we'll cover that stuff. We'll cover some industry best practices. But again, if you got questions, things that you want to discuss, feel free to bring that stuff up. We'll make sure it's relevant, and we try to cover as much as we can as possible. So again, this is a short time frame within an hour, so we can't cover every single word and every single part of the standard to its entirety. But we're going to cover them as much as we can possibly. So as I mentioned, my name is Drew Hinton. I'm the president and CEO of Aero Safety. I've been in safety for about 15 years. Started this company about 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago. I've worked as corporate safety directors for industrial construction companies, worked as global EHS managers for a chemical manufacturer with sites across the world, and also served as 12 years as a career firefighter, EMT in Louisville, Kentucky. So I've been in a variety of different hot and in elevated temperatures, you could say. Have done some teaching at Capital Technology University. Do have a PhD in occupational health and safety. But all that being said, I'm going to help you understand this standard. I'm going to help you understand the proposed rule, and I want to make sure that we are helping you understand how this will apply to your specific work environment, whether it's inside, whether it's outside, or a combination of both. And so overall, we'll talk about the proposed standard. We'll briefly talk about injuries and illnesses. We're not going to get too much into like the medical aspects of it, but we will talk about what OSHA, as far as their standard, what do they consider to be, an injury or a heat-related injury, illness? What do they consider to be emergency? Things like that. One of the big things that we'll discuss and how that really relates into the entire concept is the initial and high heat triggers. So as we go throughout that, we'll see that there are a couple different options for that, but we'll also look at underlying factors as an individual. So how does your personal health factors or your employees' personal health factors, how do those factor into the heat stress levels? We'll look at some control measures, industry best practices, and we'll play all that into it. So I'm going to pull a poll up here real quick just to kind of see where everybody's working at. So it should be popping up on your screen. So the question is, what type of work environment is your workforce typically exposed to? Is it primarily indoors, primarily outdoors, or is it a little bit of both? So go ahead and see if it's not popping up. Let me know. But if you go ahead and let us know where you are working, where you are working at primarily. So it looks like a lot of us so far are a little bit of both. One of them saying primarily outdoors. And I know sometimes people may be having workforce. Let's just say you have 100 employees, and 95 of those employees are indoors, and 5 of those are outdoors. So okay, good deal. So it looks like people are a little bit of a mixture of both indoors and outdoors, which is great. So it just kind of helps me understand, what kind of environment we're talking to as far as you all that are attending this heat safety summit. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here. If we look at heat-related issues and incidents over the years, 2023 was a record year for this stuff. So if you look at the trend from 1999 to 2023, in 23 we had a 2,325 reported heat-related illnesses and incidents, and those are what's reported at hospitals that the people were that actually admitted. Now, kind of my, preface this with just the same thing I tell anybody when there's any kind of workplace-related data, or whether it's especially like fatalities and incidents, a lot of that stuff's typically underrated and underreported. For the reason that if you think about who OSHA does not cover, so if we're talking about OSHA standard, who OSHA does not cover, they don't cover self-employed individuals. So if you think about how many people are out there in the world, in the U.S., that are plumbers, electricians, construction workers, whoever it is, that are just kind of a one-man show that would be outside OSHA's jurisdiction. So you might hear it on the 6 o'clock news that somebody died from a heat stroke out in your community, but you typically wouldn't see those things reported in OSHA's data. And so, but again, we are seeing a gradual incline, like I said, with 2023 being our worst year for heat-related incidents for the last, since 1999 at a minimum. And if you want to break this down even further, you can just kind of give you some data. If you want to create a training program at your workplace, you can go to the CDC. They have a daily heat-related illness, their heat injury tracker. You can go in there and publish and choose the date. As you can see on the right side of the screen here, you can choose the date, and then it'll show, as you see about the data, it shows that the rate of emergency department visits associated with heat-related illnesses per 100,000 ED visits by the region. And you can break that down even further. If you hover over the different areas, you can see, if you look over like the LA, San Francisco area, those little yellow sections in there, you can see like what part of those areas are, what city or county, things like that. So it's just, again, additional information if you want to look specifically in your region, or maybe the people that you're monitoring and overseeing workers in different various areas of the country, you can kind of get a little bit better understanding of that information. So earlier we did talk about underlying risk factors. So everybody's got a little bit different underlying health conditions. Whether you're in great health, you may overall be great health, but you still have a few things that are underlying, or maybe you do have a little bit more trouble on the health side, or some of your workers have that. So there's a lot of different things that can play into this stuff. And this chart here, this picture here, comes from the NIOSH. So one of the things that we'll talk about as we go throughout the standard, again, is OSHA's proposed standard. But a lot of this information came from a NIOSH publication that came out almost 10 years ago, back in 2016. And this is from that. So you can look at, not just the high temperatures, humidity, and direct sun exposure, but also you're looking at the PPE. We're looking at their physical condition and health problems. We're looking at medications, and are they taking, they drink their daily dose of coffee that morning, or taking a big energy drink that's going to have them higher risk of heat-related illnesses and injuries. So there's a lot of things that we can take into consideration when we're considering underlying health factors and risk factors. But if we dive into the standard itself, if we look at overall right now as it stands, there is no federal OSHA standard specifically addressing heat stress, and that's one that they've been kind of throwing around for years. Now, as you see, there are some OSHA-approved state plans that do have a heat standard not addressed by federal OSHA, like you see California, Colorado, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington. And if you're not in those states, some of those states are specific to, for example, some of those may be specific to only indoor work environments. And then again, that's NIOSH. They have published a document which we'll reference throughout. A lot of the proposed standard did come from that. They have a NIOSH publication from 2016. So we'll kind of break that down and dive into that. So right now is the rulemaking process. Back in 2021, again, whether you've been following this process or not, back in 2021, OSHA published their advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and then they published that actual notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register back in 2024. And they ended up extending the public comment period, but that is now passed. January 14th was the when that date ended. But they do have an upcoming virtual informal public hearing on the proposed rule that starts on July 16th of this year. As you can see there, if you want to provide an oral testimony, some documentary evidence, or question witnesses at the hearing, you got to submit a notice of intention to appear on or before May 2nd. If you just want to attend and just basically just listen and view it, you don't have to submit anything. And of course, you can follow along in this whole rulemaking process by visiting that link below. Now, if we look at just a couple of definitions, there's a ton of definitions, whether you look at the OSHA standard, that's a proposed standard, or the NIOSH standard, there's a ton of definitions, but ones we want to kind of make sure that we're understanding, at least as far as OSHA is interpreting it. So they may refer to as ambient temperature. It's what we typically refer to as air temperature or dry bulb temperature. So it's kind of what we typically refer to as on a daily basis. But when they refer to as heat index, you'll see heat index throughout this whole standard. It's the National Weather Service heat index, which combines ambient temperature and humidity. And if you're going outdoor areas, you can use, some of you all may be familiar with and or use OSHA/NIOSH's heat safety tool. It's an app on your phone that you can use to plug in your location and gives you hourly updates, things like that. And then any other phone-based weather apps can be used. If it's an indoor location, you can use enter measurements of relative humidity and ambient temperatures into the NOAA heat index calculator. So if you haven't used that, you can go straight to the NOAA website. You can just type in the heat index calculator, pull it up, and you can punch in different information, and it'll give you the heat index for your indoor work environment. It says as well as you can also use other monitoring devices that report heat index. So if you're not familiar with the heat index chart, so this is just out straight from the National Weather Service's website. You kind of just plug in the relative humidity, plug in the temperature, and you can see where that crosses at, and that'll help you determine the likelihood of those heat disorders. So whether it's a caution, just maybe it's a little bit high temperature, but not too big of an issue, extreme caution, danger, and extreme danger is when we need to really make a lot of efforts to either possibly postpone the work or just take really aggressive measures to make sure we're protecting our employees. You also see throughout the standard wet bulb globe temperature. So if you're not familiar with that, a lot of industrial hygiene professionals are going to be using this quite a bit or have used this quite a bit. It's a heat metric that takes into account ambient temperature, humidity, radiant heat from sunlight or any other artificial heat sources, and air movement. And you can use this both indoors and outdoors. And this is also used by NIOSH as well as ACGIH in their guidance for evaluating occupational heat stress also. Now, two of the triggers throughout this standard, you're going to have an initial heat trigger and you're going to have a high heat trigger. So the initial heat trigger is when you're going to have a heat index of 80 degrees Fahrenheit or a wet bulb globe temperature equal to the NIOSH recommended alert limit. And so I like to explain the recommended alert limit. It's kind of like an action level. So if you think about, for example, some of these OSHA standards, asbestos, things like that, they may have an exposure limit and then an action level. This is kind of that lower limit. And this is typically developed from NIOSH to develop the recommended alert limit to protect most healthy, non-acclimatized employees. So it means they haven't been exposed to that type of heat at least typically in the last 14 days. So initial heat trigger is 80 degrees Fahrenheit or a WBGT equal to NIOSH's recommended alert limit. And then you have your high heat trigger, which is when you have a heat index of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or a WBGT equal to NIOSH's recommended exposure limit. So this is that recommended exposure limit for this aspect of it is designed and developed to protect most healthy acclimatized workers. So people that have been working in either your work environment that you're talking about or a similar work environment. So as we get later on, we get to the whole section about getting workers used to that heat. Maybe they are off work for 2 weeks. So sometimes work environments or work schedules, you may have like a 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off schedule that you're dealing with. If that person was working in similar conditions in the last 14 days, and you can prove that, you may not have to go through the full acclimatization schedule. So we'll get more into that here in a little bit. A couple other definitions. So one is indoors versus outdoors, and this is straight from OSHA's proposed standard. So understanding what they are referring to, because there will be specific requirements for indoor environments and versus outdoors. So understanding what they're meaning. So indoors is an area under a ceiling or overhead covering that restricts airflow and has along its entire perimeter walls, doors, windows, dividers, or other physical barriers that restrict airflow, whether open or closed. Examples they give you include, but not limited to, working in a garage, even if the door is open, interior of a warehouse, even if it has multiple doors that are open or loading docks, a shed with four walls and a ceiling, even if the windows are open, and then even construction activity when performed inside a structure after the outside walls and roof are put up. Now, the opposite side of things are outdoors is an area that's not indoors as previously defined, such as vehicles operated outdoors, and it talks about an exemption here. So we'll talk about maybe like delivery drivers, anybody that's maybe in and out of vehicles on a regular basis throughout the day. We'll talk about some of those exceptions, and then tasks performed in agricultural fields and under canopies and pavilions. There are a few requirements within the standard that talk about vapor impermeable clothing. So this is full body clothing that significantly inhibits or completely prevents sweat produced by the body from evaporating into the outside air, such as encapsulating suits, different types of chemical protective clothing, chemical resistant suits, and any other forms of non-breathable PPE. So depending on your task, a common type of PPE people might wear in a variety of different industries is just kind of the common Tyvek suit. And in addition to the one you see in the picture here, you might have even a hooded Tyvek suit, which even adds more to that. So there are, like I said, there are a few requirements that talk about vapor impermeable clothing. If you're utilizing that in the workplace, there's a few things that you will have to make sure that you're addressing. Now, as far as the scope of the standard, who it actually applies to overall, and I will preface, there are several exemptions to this. Overall, it applies to all employers subject to OSHA's jurisdiction, no matter whether you're in general industry, construction, maritime, or agricultural, whether you're indoors and outdoors. But like I said, there are several exemptions, which we'll cover on the next few slides. And at the end of the day, it's up to the employer. It's up to you as your organization to figure out if you are needing to comply with these particular standards. So one of the exemptions that we're going to talk about is working at air-conditioned indoor sites kept below 80 degrees Fahrenheit ambient temperature. So earlier we talked about some of those wet bulb globe temperatures. This one's specifically talking about ambient temperatures, what we typically think about when we say it's 80. I got the thermostat set at 80 degrees inside, things like that. So it only applies to indoor work areas and vehicles that are consistently below that 80 degree Fahrenheit threshold, but you have to ensure that the AC system consistently maintains the temperatures below that temperature threshold. They're going to expect that if you do have a malfunction, if you do have some kind of issue with your AC system, that you get that addressed promptly. And if we have, this could be, like I said, this could be a warehouse, this could be just a normal typical office building, no matter what it is. We're thinking about, like I said, an ambient temperature below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, the reason they're separating this ambient temperature, because most of the things that we're talking about throughout this is heat index and that wet bulb globe temperature. The reason they're using ambient, because most HVAC systems that we're typically using on indoor systems are going to report ambient temperature. A properly functioning HVAC unit will regulate indoor humidity levels, which also results in similar measures of ambient temperatures and heat index. So again, the key word there is that it is going to be looking ambient versus the different ones there. The next exemption is telework. So if you are working at a home office, you're working out of an office in your house or any other remote locations of the employee's choosing. So for example, if you decide you just want to go to Starbucks and work from there or whatever, some other kind of remote location of your choosing or of the employee's choosing, kind of the same concept applies to pretty much any other standard, right? OSHA typically doesn't hold employers liable for employees' home offices and conditions of the telework environment. So they're not going to go out and inspect somebody's house, or typically not holding that employer liable for that. But only the work performed while teleworking would be exempt. So as an example, if let's say they worked, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they would work at home out of their home office, but Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, they would come into a potentially high heat environment. That Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they would be covered by the standard, whereas the Tuesday, Thursday they wouldn't be. So again, they must comply with the standard whenever they are on site, as long as no other exemptions apply. Another exemption we're going to talk about is indoor sedentary work activities. A lot of what we typically think of as office work. So these are work activities that only involve some combination of the following: sitting, occasional standing, walking for brief periods of time, and occasional lifting of objects weighing less than 10 pounds. And when they talk about the term occasional, which they take this definition from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they mean up to a third of the workday. Says, however, these activities can only be performed for brief periods of time over the course of the day for that to apply, and that currently applies regardless of the indoor temperature. So maybe it is a little bit over 80 degrees. This exemption may still potentially apply to your work environment. Now, if we look at another exemption we may run into, short duration exposures at or above the initial heat trigger. So initial heat trigger is, again, the 80 degree Fahrenheit heat index or the NIOSH recommended alert on that, the lower limit. So short duration exposures at or above the initial heat trigger of 15 minutes or less in any 60-minute period. So it sounds like a lot of wording on there. So I like to kind of coincide this one. It's like a short-term exposure limit if you deal with chemicals, kind of like your STEL limit. So they've preliminarily concluded that intermittent exposures within that 15-minute time frame are not likely to significantly raise core body temperatures and result in heat-related injuries and illnesses. If you have a state plans like in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, this is very consistent with what you already have in place. So as an example, an employee who occasionally walks to collect mail outside of the temperature at or above the initial heat trigger for 50 minutes or less in any 60-minute period would still be exempt. So, maybe you're in a hot environment. We're kind of talking about in the chat that a few places are getting in the upper 80s already, sometimes even getting above that. If we're just walking outside, maybe a 95-degree environment, walking into the streets, into the parking lot to get the mail, and then we're back into a office setting. The admin workers are back in the office setting. That would potentially meet this exemption. Another exemption we have here is emergency response activities. A lot of these things that we're going to be talking about in this exemption are, workplace emergency response teams, ERTs. If you have site EMS personnel, technical search and rescue teams, things like that. As you can see here, these are things that maybe are going to be covered by other applicable standards. So like 1910-120 is OSHA's ASWAPER standard. 1910-146 is going to cover confined space entry, but it's going to be referring specifically to the rescue side. And then, of course, they're going through the emergency response standard update right now. The previous industrial fire brigade standard, they're updating that. So it applies to organizations whose primary function is firefighting activities, and it does include training activities as well. So just because it's not an actual fire, maybe it's a training scenario, training evolution they're doing, would still be covered under that. It says employers with employees who perform emergency response activities as a collateral duty. This exemption only applies when they're performing those collateral duties. So, for example, a lot of workplaces, probably a lot of people on this webinar today, probably have people trained in CPR, AED, first aid, and they're typically collateral duties. Now, maybe you're a workplace that is fortunate enough to have an on-site nurse or EMTs, whatever it may be, but a lot of those are collateral duties. So if I was responding to a firefighting response, then it would only cover you just specifically during those activities. So again, there's a lot of other standards that come into play here. Now, although OSHA is proposing to exempt fire departments entirely from their new proposed from this standard here, they're not proposing the entire entirely exempt organizations that have employees who perform EMS or technical search and rescue. The reason for this, many organizations perform EMS, such as, when I say EMS, emergency medical services, such as hospitals or technical search and rescue, also conduct many other activities unrelated to that emergency response, and OSHA wants to make sure they're still covered. Now, if we talk about heat-related illness, and on the next slide, we'll see heat-related emergencies. This is defined within OSHA's proposed standard. So potential signs and symptoms of a heat-related illness may include headache, nausea, weakness, dizziness, elevated body temperatures, muscle cramps, and then muscle pain or spasm. Again, these are just potential signs. There could be other underlying factors going on as far as maybe it's non-heat related. They're still having the same symptoms, but these are always obviously just potential signs and symptoms that we may see or experience. Now, the opposite side of things is a heat-related emergency. This is one thing that when we get to the training section at the very end, that you will have to train your employees on what is a heat-related illness that we can handle this in-house. We can take care of it at a first aid level, even just basic first aid to trained employees, versus what is an emergency. When do they have to take the advanced steps of your emergency action plan, call 911, things like that. So symptoms of a heat-related emergency may include loss of consciousness, which is basically fainting or collapsing, passing out with excessive body temperature, may or may not be accompanied by vertigo, nausea, headache, cerebral dysfunctions, or bizarre behavior. And then may also have staggering, vomiting, could be acting irrationally or disoriented, having convulsions, or even after resting, having an elevated heart rate. And so there's a lot of things. Again, you may not see all these symptoms. You may only see a few of these symptoms out there, but those are going to be defined in the proposed standard. So we will break this portion down quite a bit, but overall, if you're covered by the standard, either all of your organization or even just part of it. If you have employees that do fall under this standard, all covered employers must, one, they got to identify and evaluate their heat hazards. Where are they exposed to the heat? They have to do an evaluation, things like that. We'll look at they have to develop a heat illness and emergency response procedure. So you may already have something similar to this in your typical emergency action plans, your EAPs, like you have with your medical emergencies and fires and explosions, things like that. You may already have something in place, but you may want to supplement that with additional topics that are required by this proposed OSHA standard. You're going to have to implement training for employees and supervisors. So they're going to have a couple specific training requirements for supervisors of all the employees that are working in these elevated temperatures, as well as just general training for all employees. One of the big components is having a site-specific heat injury and illness prevention plan. So we'll talk about whether it needs to be documented or verbal, and then implementing the applicable record-keeping procedures. So I'll preface those record-keeping procedures. The only ones they have proposed as of right now only apply to indoor work environments. Now, we'll talk about that later. Doesn't mean that just again, OSHA is always the bare minimum. So we may still, as a best practice, want to implement these record-keeping procedures to the extent feasible, even for outdoor environments. So we'll get into those as we'll break these things down individually. So any workplace cover has to establish at least one heat safety coordinator. This heat safety coordinator, it could be your safety or EHS professional. It could be a supervisor. It's just any employee capable of performing the role who receives the required training to do that role. And so that as you see throughout the standard, it will tell you what a heat safety coordinator has to do. And so as long as you train them to those duties and they're qualified and competent to do those duties, then it could be anybody. Like I said, it doesn't have to be a safety professional or EHS professional. It could just be one of the floor supervisors or construction supervisor, project supervisor that's out there working with the team. So it doesn't require any kind of specialized training. You don't have to go through a certification course or anything like that. But they do have to have the authority to ensure compliance with all aspects of the plan to ensure that they can take prompt corrective measures when a hazard is identified. So, for example, this is very similar to a competent person in a lot of topics. So if you think about fall protection or electrical safety, if you go like the NFPA 70E standard, you're gonna have a competent person, and one big aspect of that competent person's roles is to having the authority from the company, from the employer, to take those prompt corrective actions. Everybody has the authority to say, we're stopping, it's unsafe work, we're taking a break here, but they've got to have the authority to take prompt corrective actions, within reason, whenever those hazards identified. So those possible duties could include conducting regular inspections of the work site to ensure that the plan is being implemented appropriately and to monitor the ongoing effectiveness of the plan. Now, if you want to create a document or an inspection form that you want to use to document that you're doing these inspections, then you're more than welcome to do so. Maybe recommend a best practice. And during those inspections, the heat safety coordinator could observe employees to ensure they're protecting themselves by frequently drinking water and or taking rest breaks that they would be required to provide. So as we get to later, there will be required rest breaks for certain employees, and sometimes maybe even what they call unscheduled breaks. So maybe that employee thinks that they're just getting, it's not a scheduled break time, but they are starting to feel the effects, or somebody notices the effects of heat illnesses, and they want to go in and take an unscheduled break, but it has to be heat related. You can't just decide, oh, I want to take a break right now. It does have to be heat related. And so again, this heat safety coordinator, you have to have at least one. So obviously the size of your company will dictate how many you actually have within your facility. So overall, the plan, we develop and implement a work site specific plan with site specific information to evaluate and control those heat hazards that we're dealing with. Now, if you see at the bottom, we'll kind of go to the bottom and backtrack. If you have over 10 employees, they're proposing that you document this plan. This kind of same concept with like the emergency action plans. You document it with over 10 employees. Less than 10 employees or less, you can do this verbally. Now, it doesn't mean that, if you have 8 employees or 9 employees, it doesn't mean you can't document it. The more documentation, if you've been in safety for any amount of time, you know that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So any documentation, even if OSHA says you are exempt, is obviously a best practice, even if you're not required. But this is going to make sure that all affected employees understand what heat hazards they're exposed to, where those exist, and then what site-specific measures that must be utilized to address those hazards. And if you have multiple work sites that are substantially similar, you can create it by work site type rather than by individual work, as long as any site-specific information is included, and such as phone numbers and addresses or site-specific heat sources. So kind of you may potentially be able to create per se a corporate policy and then hand that out to different work environments. If they're all similar work environments as far as the heat stress and heat hazards, you could potentially kind of create a corporate policy and send that out. And then they would plug in just, the little site specific information, emergency phone numbers, the address, things like that they want to plug in there. But again, if it's over 10 employees at the work site, then you have to document that. Now, that's cut off. Like I said, that cut off for 10 employees is consistent with OSHA's practices for allowing employees 10 or fewer to communicate their emergency action plans and fire prevention plans. Same thing orally. And so you have typically with less than 10 employees, you got less complications communicating that stuff verbally. And so they don't believe that there's a high likelihood of misunderstanding when employers communicate their plans to employees verbally with that small number of people. And so again, as a result, OSHA doesn't believe that the added burden on a small employer with 8 employees, things like that, establishing a written plan is necessary. But like I said, you can by all means go ahead and go above and beyond because OSHA is absolutely bare minimum on this. Now, as far as what needs to be in the plan itself, the contents of that plan. So you got to have a comprehensive list of the types of work activities covered by the plan. You have to have a documented hazard evaluation, which we'll get to a little on the next slide. You have to list out who are your designated heat safety coordinator or coordinators. If you have more than one, any policy procedures for any workers wearing vapor impermeable clothing. So again, we talked about why we defined that earlier, because you will have to have procedures for people wearing that because they may be, maybe that 1 or 2 employees that you have wearing those Tyvek suits maybe are probably going to be a little bit higher heat stress risk than maybe your other 98% of your workers that you're dealing with. You also have to include any other policy procedures necessary to comply with either the OSHA standard that we're talking about today or any other applicable local, state, or federal law standards, guidelines that are applicable to this topic. And then what heat metric are you using? Are you using the heat index? Are you using the wet bulb globe temperature? Those contents. So for example, if you had a landscaping company, you could indicate that all of your employees working outdoors at or above the initial heat trigger for at least 15 minutes in a 60-minute period. Maybe that's all of your workers that you would have to indicate that they are covered by the plan. Any employees capable of performing the role who receives the training required by the paragraphs that are mentioned. There are several paragraphs in the standard can be designated as those heat safety coordinators. Again, it doesn't require any kind of specialized training. Doesn't have to be anybody. Does not have to be a safety professional. But those are the required minimum contents. So the next slide we'll get into, we'll talk about the hazard evaluation. So they do not have a specific form of what has to be on that, but they do have a couple things that they recommend. If you think about, for example, those of you all that deal with confined spaces and deal with a permit system, right? There are minimum contents of what has to be on that permit if you're going into an entry permit for a confined space. So they don't specify a specific form, but they do say that an effective hazard evaluation would include a review of environmental heat exposures, any high-risk areas, tasks, and occupations, and then evaluation of the length of time and intensity of the task when wearing any vapor impermeable clothing. So you can determine which areas are expected to have those exposures at or above that initial heat trigger, either by consulting various data sources. So maybe there's a lot of places out throughout the internet that you can find similar data sources of studies and research and environments that are similar to yours, or you can have previously collected data that you've done yourself, or maybe the company's done prior to you arriving, any kind of site or process surveys. You've done employee interviews and input, which is going to be a big part of this standard as well, as you'll see throughout, and then any heat, injury, and illness surveillance data that you have. So again, one of the big things about this standard is going to be that employee involvement. Now, if you're dealing with outdoor work environments, so you may be dabbling a little bit with both. If you're dealing with outdoor environments, you have to monitor those heat conditions by tracking the local heat index forecast or measuring the heat metric using one of a metric of your choosing, either the heat index or the wet bulb globe temperature. If you use that heat index forecast, you got to get the information from your local National Weather Service office, the OSHA and IOSH Heat Safety Tool app that a lot of you probably have at least heard of, maybe even used, or in another weather forecast website or app. If you're doing on-site monitoring, you need to set those devices up as close as possible to the work area where they're at. So maybe you set up a device on a tripod just a few yards away from that employee. If you have multiple work areas at the same site, so let's say we got people over on the one side of the project side or work area, and then we have people working maybe 50 feet over a different area, probably it's going to be pretty similar data that you're going to find on there. So it says for multiple work areas at the same work site, you can use a single monitoring device if there's no reasonable anticipation that the heat exposure will differ between work areas. So Like I said, they're pretty fairly close proximity. In most cases, a lot of cases, you could use a single monitoring device rather than setting one up at every single work group or work area that you have. Now, if you're doing indoor work sites, you'll identify all of those work areas where there's a reasonable expectation that employees are or may be exposed to heat at or above the initial heat trigger, and then implement the plan for monitoring these areas to determine when exposure is above the initial high heat triggers occurs using the heat metrics that you're of your choosing. So again, that heat metric could be heat index or the wet bulb globe temperature. Now we'll implement this plan. One of the big parts of it, and I think it's a really best practice, really for just about any kind of policy or procedure, is get people involved with it that are doing the work. You get people involved with it that are actually affected by this stuff. So they will require you to seek input and involvement of non-managerial employees and their respective their representatives, if any. So if they have like a union representative, or if it ever gets into a legal case, things like that, in the development of implementation of the plan. So, for example, it's just like I said, it's very, very similar to even the bloodborne pathogen standard from OSHA. They tell you the exact same thing. The bloodborne pathogen standard will tell you to seek input and involvement of non-managerial employees responsible for patient care. It's the exact same concept here. So get the input from the folks that are actually affected by this, and let them tell you if it's obviously maybe they're not the safety professionals or the ones that's well versed in the standard. But at least let them review it and let them give you the input on the tasks that they're doing and hazards they're facing. And then if you develop controls, let them take a look at that and say, and let them give feedback on whether they think that's effective or not. You'll also have to review and evaluate the effectiveness of the plan at least annually, as well as anytime there is a heat-related injury, illness occurs that results in a death, any kind of days away from work, medical treatment beyond first aid, kind of what we call it OSHA reportable, and then any loss of consciousness. It's got to be the language that each employee supervisor and heat safety coordinator understands. Now, as far as the translation, so it has to be in the language that they understand. But if you have, for example, if you have somebody that is completely fluent in both English and Spanish, just as an example, if they're completely fluent in both English and Spanish, and you have it in English, and they're perfectly fine reading it, but they just say, "Hey, I prefer that you put it in Spanish," you would not be required to translate that to Spanish if it's just a preferment. Now, if they could not, they weren't properly, like I said, they weren't very, they were maybe illiterate, or they couldn't understand that particular Spanish language, then you would have to actually translate that over. So, and also in addition to that, so if you have one or more employees that are not literate, they're illiterate, the employer would have to ensure that someone is available to read the written plan in a language that each employee understands. Likewise, for employees that have less than 10 employees, the employer would have to ensure that someone is available to explain the plan in a language that each employee, supervisor, and heat safety coordinator understands. And so they expect that an individual who speaks employees' languages will be available in all workplaces, since effective communication between individuals, such as employers, supervisors, and employees, would need to occur anyways. And so it doesn't have to be, if it's preferred language, it's optional for you, but if they cannot understand the language you have in, if it's English, then you have to translate that. Now, some of you all may have translation service, but make sure that the translator, whether it's a service that you use or it's a employee that you have on staff, that is bilingual. Make sure that the translation is actually translating it in direct translation, because if anybody's dealt with different languages, sometimes there's things that don't translate, word for word. So maybe I translate, something from English to Spanish or vice versa, Spanish to English. Sometimes it does it, the message gets construed and messed up a little bit when we do that. So you have to make sure that whoever's translating it is able to understand the lingo and actually translate it to the appropriate manner. Now, we talked about earlier that initial heat trigger. So initial heat trigger being 80 degrees Fahrenheit or an IOSHA's lower level, the recommended alert level. We're going to implement control measures at or above this threshold that include providing employees with readily accessible, cool, potable drinking water, and they do specify that you should have access to. Now, if the employee wants to decline this, they're more than welcome to do so, but have access to basically 1 quart of water per employee per hour. So if maybe you have continuous a water fountain, just continuous drinking, that's one thing. But if you're out of the job site, outdoors especially, maybe you just have a cooler with water bottles. Now they do actually get into aspects like if I am just providing a cooler or maybe a jug or something to get water from, that if everybody is using that same thing, then if they don't bring their own cups or bottles, then you have to provide those for them as well. Now, we also have to have readily accessible break areas with cooling measures, which can either be shade or air conditioning. Indoor work area controls such as fans, dehumidifiers, air conditioning, opening windows, shielding or isolation of radiant heat sources, and then making sure that acclimatize the protocols for new and returning employees, which we'll get into here in a little bit. Paid rest breaks if needed to prevent overheating. So if it's initial heat trigger, it says paid rest breaks if needed. And we get to the high heat trigger, and we'll see a little bit difference of the wording there. And then regular and effective two-way communication. So two-way communication sounds very simple, but making sure that we have two-way, not one-way. So I need to make sure they are understanding what I'm telling them, or if I just say, hey, everybody's got water breaks, there's water over on the truck, or there's water over in the break room, whatever it is, that we get some kind of head nod or a thumbs up, or they verbally acknowledge that. So it has to be two-way communication on that aspect. Now, if we bump it up to the high
Hey,
heat,
hey, Drew, I want to actually, there's a question here that might be relevant to that last slide.
okay, what about
Uh,
here?
John asks, I'm trying to come up with a communication tool for the field for locations within North Carolina. I'm thinking group text, letting them know the expected weather for the day, heat index, etc. I then also want to include symptoms, preventative measures, etc. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so if it's outdoors, can sometimes be tricky. So sometimes, and OSHA will even mention some of this in their proposed standards. Great question. But some of the things, examples, sometimes they may be able to post something. So a lot of construction sites. I was just at one the other day. They were doing some site clearing, and they had more or less a bulletin board at the site. Sometimes you can post that, but sometimes you can do mass communication group text on there as well. So you're letting them know, hey, after lunch we're going to be over that threshold. The initial either 80 degrees, 90 degrees, the initial or high heat triggers. You can let them know we're going to be over the threshold. After lunch, we're going to maybe we start staggering the breaks, or we start doing some different scheduling, or we're going to change up the schedule for that day. And we're planning on doing XYZ task after lunch, but that's probably going to be the hot time of the day. So let's rearrange that to the earlier part of the day, where it's a little more cooler. How you communicate that is it's up to you. This is that aspect of it's not a performance objective per se. It's not something OSHA says this is how you do that two-way communication. It's that you have to have that. You just have to have that. So, like I said, if you think group text, as long as everybody's available on the group text now, with texting, you do have to take into consideration, service consideration as far as their phone service. I even know like right now, I'm not getting the whole Android iPhone issue right now, but like I know a lot of phones right now are going into that RCS text mode. And if you stick on that RCS texting mode, if they're not online, they may not get that message until later in the day. And so having maybe a backup way to verify. So maybe you send a group text out 6 o'clock in the morning, you're going out there to meet at the job site at 7, and then you get at 7 o'clock, maybe you just reconfirm, hey, did everybody get this text, or did everybody good on the measures I sent out this morning, and verify that one way there. Because like I said, if we do a group text and not everybody got the text because they didn't have service that day, their phone was messed up, whatever the reason was, then that wouldn't be compliant, per se, because you're not getting two-way communication, at least even with just a portion of it. But the kind of the like I said, there's a lot of different ways. You can do text, you can do posting a signage, and maybe change out a little sheet on once a day. You change it out, put it up there, and tell what the hazards are, what measures you're taking, things like that. But that's a great question. So, but again, on text messages, just make sure that the phone services issue, make sure that's properly addressed and somehow confirming it. So sometimes you can do that with read receipts if you know that if it says sometimes on your text app or whatever phone you're using, it may tell you read by employee A, B, C, and D. If it does that, then that would be a way of verifying that. Now, again, that could be they just open a text and close it out real quick because something come up, they didn't actually read it, but they opened it, so it says it is. But yeah, that's definitely a consideration. Like I said, OSHA doesn't. It's not. They're not giving you a performance objective that says here's how you do it. They just kind of tell you do it, and it's up to you as an employer to figure out what works best for your situation. But great question. All right. Moving on to the high heat trigger. So again, this is the 90 degrees threshold or the REL recommended exposure limit from NIOSH on this. So at this point, once I hit the high heat trigger, we have mandatory rest breaks of 15 minutes at least every 2 hours. And they do say that an unpaid meal break can count as a rest break. They have to, we have to have observation for signs and symptoms of heat-related illness. So this will kind of tag into the to the training aspect of it. We have to implement a hazard alert to remind employees of key parts of the plan, and then warning signs at the indoor work areas if it's indoor specifically with ambient temperatures that regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we move on to the rest break. So I know just talking with people throughout different industries, this was always a big topic or a topic of discussion for this was how does the rest breaks play into it? So it says employers must allow and encourage employees to take paid rest breaks in the break areas if needed. So if it's an initial heat trigger, you can take rest breaks if needed. And if it's high heat trigger, then they are required to make them take the 15-minute breaks at the required intervals. So for unscheduled breaks, it says employees be allowed to decide on the timing and frequency of those unscheduled breaks, but they have to be heat related. They can't just say, "Well, I just tired of doing the work right now. I'm gonna go take a break real quick. I've been doing this for a while. I want to take a break." It has to be heat related. Hey, I'm really starting to sweat quite a bit. I'm gonna take a break here. Give me some water. I'm gonna go sit in the shade for a minute. So it has to be heat related. If the work process is such that allowing employees to leave their workstation at their election, which means at their disposal, would present a hazard to the employee or others, or if it would result in harm to the employer's equipment or product, the employer could require the employee to notify a supervisor and then make sure somebody relieves them as long as the supervisor is immediately available and relieves them as quickly as possible. Now, key thing here is that rest breaks are not the same as slowing down or pacing it, right? So pacing may be an administrative control you put into place, but that does not mean, hey, we're going a little bit slower today. That's not the same as rest breaks. You have to follow OSHA's required rest breaks on this aspect of it. Observation. So one of the aspects of the plan was make sure we observe employees for signs or symptoms of heat-related illness, using one or two options. So if we have multiple employees, basically you have more than one employee in this system, you have one or two options. You can implement a buddy system where basically one person keeps an eye on it, they keep an eye on each other, or I can have observation by a supervisor or a heat safety coordinator, as long as that person is not supervising more than 20 employees. So you got to think about fire service, fire department working from there. We call that span of control. Right? There's only so many people that you can manage effectively and effectively supervise. So no more than 20 per supervisor or heat safety coordinator. Obviously, the fewer the better. If I can only observe 5 or so, that's a better option there. If you are working alone, if you have lone workers in situations, then you have to maintain effective two-way communication, and you have to check in at least every 2 hours. And this is also where that two-way communication really comes into play. So I just radio out to them every 2 hours and say, "Hey, just checking in on you." Always, if I don't get a response back, if I don't hear from them, then I need to start implementing my emergency response procedures, having somebody go out and check on them if it's something feasible, or if it's not something I can send out somebody readily to do. Maybe we're calling 911 and sending them out there to that address or that GPS coordinates, whatever it may be. Now, if we have if we are over those triggers, we have to implement a hazard alert to alert employees prior to the work shift or whenever you determine that they're exposed to heat at or above that high heat trigger. And so they have to be notified of the importance of drinking plenty of water, their right to, at their discretion, take unscheduled rest breaks if needed, as well as the required rest breaks, how to seek help and protect, and the procedures to take in a heat emergency. And then if you have a mobile work site, they have a couple of paragraphs in there, information on the location of those break areas required and the drinking water required by those paragraphs as well. If it is an indoor work area that has temperatures that regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, you have to have signage that is legible, visible, and understandable to employees in that work area, and they have to be able to see that signage before they enter that. So if you have it maybe it could be on the exterior door or a wall, but you can't put that sign in the actual high heat area. They have to see that signage before they get there. So legible, visible, understandable to employees in the work area. And when they define regularly, so it talks about that it regularly exceeds 120 degrees Fahrenheit. They mean a pattern or frequency of occurrence rather than isolated incidents. Says this means that the indoor work areas experience temperatures exceeding 120 on a frequent or recurring basis, such as daily during certain seasons or under specific operational conditions. Now, if we get to acclimatization, so getting the employees used to that work environment from a heat perspective. So if I have new employees, we'll have a chart on a couple of slides. We'll have a chart kind of summarize these next two slides. So if I have new employees, basically it means that they have not been exposed to that type of heat in the last 14 days. Then I have to implement one of two options for that during the first week on the job. So option A is I can go ahead and put all of the high heat trigger measures in place during their first week of measure, or option B is I do a gradual exposure to heat at or above the high heat trigger. And so we'll get to that option B on the next couple of slides. And then if I have returning employees, which means they have been must implement one of two options for returning employees during first week back on the job after more than 14 days away. So the key word is more than 14 days. So for example, some places have a 2 week on, 2 week off, 14 days on, 14 days off. If it's a 14 days on, 14 days off, that's not more than 14 days. You would not be considered a returning employee. So option A, same thing, implement the high heat trigger measures when at or above the initial heat trigger during the first week of work. Or option B is I can do the schedule that we're going to see on the next slide. There is an exception if if that employee was consistently working under the same or similar conditions within the previous 14 days, then they wouldn't be considered a returning employee per se. And so, but they have to have engaged in similar work activities in the similar heat conditions consistently over the preceding 14 days. And when they say consistently, they mean the employee engaged in a task for at least 2 hours per day on a majority of the preceding days. So to demonstrate the employee consistently working on those same conditions, you can obtain information directly from the employee to confirm the requirements are met, considering the explanation of whatever they were doing. You could ask questions either verbally or in writing about the prior work. What were they doing? Where were they doing it at? What type of work they were doing? How long they were doing it? Things like that. And then if the employer asks new employees in the past 14 days, for example, if you ask new employees in the past 14 days, did you consistently work under the same or similar conditions as the employer, but did not ask for any supporting details, you wouldn't necessarily satisfy that requirement. So here's kind of a summary of those last two slides. And so if you see over to the far left column, first column, you got the day number. So first day back, second day, third day, fourth day, and fifth day, a new worker. So what this means is, we'll read this kind of the note at the bottom. It says employers can acclimatize by utilizing some of the employees' work time in ways that do not require exposure to heat at or above the initial heat trigger, such as completing training activities, filling out work-related paperwork in an air conditioning building, office admin work. So if it's a new worker, basically you're giving them 20% work at the, above those thresholds, above those triggers, and then 80% has to be below the triggers. Second day, for a new worker, you're at 40% out in the high heat environment, basically 60% in a low heat environment, and then 60%, 80%. And then at day 5, you can put them all the way out there the entire day. Returning worker is a little bit different. Day 1, if it's a returning worker, which means they've been out of the environment for more than 14 days, day 1 is 50% capacity, day 2, 60%, day 3, 80%, and then 100% at day 4 and beyond that. So that's just a kind of summary slide there. If you do have PPE, you got to maintain it. You're not necessarily have to provide that PPE, cooling PPE. So there's just a couple examples from Ergodyne out there, cooling vest and towels you can drape around your neck. There's a lot of cooling PPE out there. You're not required to provide that to them, but if you do provide that to them, or if they are bringing their own to comply with this, we have to make sure it's maintained at all times during use. So reports from employees indicate that the use of cooling PPE, such as cooling vests, is burdensome and increases heat retention once the cooling properties are lost or ice packs have melted, right? Because if that ice pack is melted and it's basically just warm water in there or whatever it may be, then you're basically just adding an extra layer of clothing to them, and it ends up being more burdensome and causing additional heat stress, which is kind of counterproductive there. This is a report, or this is out of a e-guide from Honeywell. It came out back about 5 years ago from Honeywell. I thought it was pretty, I remember seeing this when it first came out, and we talk about it when we do PPE classes. But I thought it was pretty interesting data, just the color of a hard hat and how that contributes to heat risk. And so we look about, just looking on the very far left side, the shell temperature versus the head temperature. Head temperature being, what is the base of the temperature of my head itself, or shell temperature being my hard hat. So if I got a head temperature of 111.6 degrees Fahrenheit on a white hard hat, and the shell temperature is 144.8. But if you look over to like the green and the blue hard hats, we're looking at shell temperatures of around 156, 157 degrees. Some of those, sometimes even the high vis hard hats, high vis yellow and high vis orange, that head temperature can get to 122.3 degrees, right? So we see, even within the examples that we see on this screen here, we see an 11 to 12, 11 degree difference from the white even to the orange on the far right. So the color of hard hat could even play a difference in that aspect of it. Other control measures we can implement, we think about the hierarchy controls. We can put in convective and radiant evaporative heat controls. And we can also implement the administrative and work practice controls as well, such as limiting the exposure time and or temperature that we're exposed to, reducing the metabolic heat load, implementing work rest schedules. And then also, I think it's a great practice is to implement medical screening or surveillance programs, right? See if they are already exposed or already at high risk of being exposed to heat stress, and then continuously monitoring that aspect of it as well. Now, one part of the plan that we also have to implement is developing and implementing a heat emergency response plan, as well as specify what an employer's responsibilities will be if an employee experiences signs and symptoms of heat-related illness or a heat-related emergency, such as the emergency phone numbers. So it could be 911 if you have an on-site nurse or EMTs or things like that, or ERTs, having their phone numbers and how to reach them, description of how to contact a supervisor and EMS, individuals that are designated to ensure that the heat emergency procedures are invoked when appropriate, how to transport employees to a place where they can be reached by EMS. So especially maybe if you're out of a remote work area or maybe even just a difficult access, how are we going to get that person to where EMS or fire department, whoever it is, how are we going to get them to where they can reach them? Work site directions. So maybe it's a street address, or if you're out off the grid, maybe you have GPS coordinates. And then emergency response procedures. So they do specify a minimum of what needs to be done in that OSHA standard, proposed standard. But again, you can feel free to go above and beyond based on your specific hazard at your work site. Now, as far as the initial training, you have to have initial training to train exposed employees on the signs and symptoms of heat-related illnesses and which ones require immediate emergency action. So not everything is we're calling 911. It could be we can handle these things in-house by our even just first aid trained individuals, and these things are going to be handled by 911, fire, EMS, whoever it is. So they do specify topics on here. I'm not going to go through every single one of these topics on here, but you can see the hazards, what the risk factors are, PPE usage as far as cooling PPE, incident reporting procedures, things like that. And so they do specify the minimum content that does have to be covered initially. So, and then retraining. So we do have to do annual refresher training. That's what they're proposing. And in addition to the annual refresher training, anytime there's an indication that employees not retain necessary understanding. So if I see them doing something they're not supposed to be doing, or vice versa, see them not doing something they should be doing, then we can send them through refresher training. Whenever there's a change that affects their exposure to heat at work, so they've got a new job, they went to a different area. If there has been a heat-related injury, illness that resulted in death, days away from work, medical treatment beyond first aid, or loss of consciousness, then we do refresh training. And then after the plan or other applicable policy procedures are updated. So if we review the plan and realize that it needs to be changed, needs to be made more site specific, or need to include something else, then we have to train them on that. So a lot of these things here, it's kind of like the forklift powered industrial truck standard. So I do my annual refresher training. We typically cover, most cases we cover everything. But if maybe I saw you doing something sketchy out there, doing something not supposed to be doing, or we change something. Sometimes you can go through and just do the retraining on just what's changed, or just what that person was doing incorrectly, whatever that may be, or what did we update on our policy. Now, as far as verification, sometimes you may have attended training, maybe you do it yourself, maybe as far as implementation, do you do a post-training testing or verification process? They don't specify how you verify that training. So they don't say that you have to do a written test or even a verbal or oral test after that. They said they do expect that all required training will include some measure of comprehension, right? So this could be a written test. It could be just as periodically as you go throughout, sometimes even through our classes that we teach. Sometimes we'll go throughout periodically and ask questions throughout about various topics or various sections of training. So you have to do some kind of measure of comprehension on it. So it could be a written test. It could be spot checks out there after the training, or it could be, like I said, just periodic questions throughout the training session itself. So just have to have some kind of comprehension checks. Now, everybody has to be provided training in a language and in a literacy level for each employee, supervisor, and heat safety coordinator that each one of them understands. So you have to, if you get in the translation, maybe a thing you have to address as well. And then must provide employees with an opportunity for questions and answers about the training materials. This is also very similar to OSHA's global patches standard. So it doesn't necessarily say you have to have a live instructor there. It doesn't say you have to have somebody there specifically during the training, but they do have to have the contact info. So it says if it's not possible to have someone present or available during the training, employers could provide the contact info of the individual that employees can contact and answer questions, and they do expect you to respond promptly, right? So, for example, if they send out a question on a Friday morning, and maybe you're off on Fridays and you're the person they're supposed to contact, and you don't respond back to them until Monday afternoon when you start checking your emails, that probably wouldn't comply. So we need to respond to them promptly. So maybe we do those schedules issues like that. Maybe we do have a secondary person they contact. So by all means, in most cases, we'll in-person training or at least having somebody there present to be at the office or at the work site to ask those questions. Having somebody there physically is the best practice by all means. But sometimes maybe that's not feasible for a variety of reasons. You have to make sure that whoever you're designated as the contact person is able to answer them promptly right away. Record keeping, these only apply specifically to indoor work areas, but it doesn't mean it's not a best practice for outdoor work areas. So if you have indoor work areas where there is a reasonable expectation that employees are or may be exposed to heat at or above the initial heat triggers to the lower limit, they must create written or electronic records of on-site temperature measurements and keep those for at least 6 months. Like I said, it does not apply to outdoor areas. It applies only specifically to indoors, but it's still best practice if you want to do that. But the reason they give you the option or say that it's not required for outdoors is because sometimes it can be a little bit difficult and sometimes even burdensome to try to maintain historical data that we're checking. We're checking the phone or app on our phone from the weather service to check what the weather is that day, or we're checking the OSHA and NIOSH heat safety tool or heat safety app. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to track those when we're at different sites. Now, a key thing about, for example, that heat safety app from OSHA and NIOSH is that if you haven't used that, it picks up the default is that it picks up the location where you're at. So if I open it up right now in our office, it'll pull up right where I'm at. But if I've got folks out working at a job site, an hour from here, that's not going to be accurate. So you have to go through and make sure that you're checking the information for where they're working, not where your office is at. But now this is also similar to OSHA's hearing conservation standard, for example. So if you think about that as it relates to 1910-1020, which is the access to employee and medical exposure records standard, there are exposure records and medical records requirements within 1910-1020, but there are some records in 1910-95, the hearing conservation standard, that supersede that. So even though they may change this between now and then, but it just says you have to keep those records for at least 6 months. Now there may be other stuff that do trigger over into 1910-20 that we have to take care of as well. As far as the effective dates, they propose an effective date 60 days after the date of publication of the final standard in the Federal Register, and then the proposed paragraph K2 of the standard would require employers to comply with all requirements of the standard 90 days after the effective date. So that gives you 150 days after the date of the publication in that Federal Register. Now, we go on to kind of summarize here, and this chart here is from, if you just search, if you go to OSHA's webpage, there's a little fact sheet or a little kind of, like it's a 2-pager, really, it's not a 1-pager, but you will see this. It's where it's from. This is kind of just a summary. So if you want to look at this recording later on and you want to just look at a summary of what everybody has to do if you're above the initial heat trigger, above the high heat trigger, again, this is just a great quick reference to find that information. Like I said, this is from OSHA's heat illness page. They have a little quick, I think, 2-page document on there is where this came from. Now, if you want additional resources, in addition to what OSHA has mentioned, ANSI has recently published ANSI ASSP A10.50 2024 edition, which is a standard for heat stress management in construction and demolition operations. So that whole A10 series of standards deals with construction and demolition operations, but it still has a lot of great references in there, and it's recently published. And then that NIOSH document, the 2016-106, is the criteria for a recommended standard occupational exposure to heat and hot environments. Actually, that came out in 2016. A lot of the standard that you're seeing proposed from OSHA did come from that document. There were several components of that document from NIOSH that has been incorporated into this proposed OSHA standard. So again, those are just some other references out there that if you want to look for some. I know the NIOSH one really digs deep into the medical aspect of it, medical surveillance aspect of it. So both ANSI and NIOSH publication. Both of those have some great resources on there. So if you want to supplement what OSHA requires with additional resources, then I definitely recommend that you check those out for sure. All right. So that concludes the presentation. Are there any other questions that were not previously addressed on here? I'm going to go ahead and bring up contact info. So if you need to hop off, here's my contact info. If you want, feel free to reach out to me on, here's my email, there's my phone number. And if you want to reach out on social media if we're not connected already, and get in touch with us. But at this time, we'll be open to take any questions anybody has. And if you need to hop off, I appreciate everybody's time and participation in this webinar. Thank you.
All right, we'll give everyone a minute just in case there are any questions being typed in the question section. But Drew, I just want to thank you for your time and energy that you put into this. A great presentation, clearly a lot to go over, and I think you did a great job of presenting that. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate everybody's time on here today. And again, this is, obviously couldn't cover everything on here. So again, if you have questions, I'll stay on for a little bit. If you have questions, feel free to chime in and we'll be glad to get those addressed for you.
Also, again, feel free. So the next session we have coming up right after this, I just want to give everyone a quick heads up. It's going to be with Cameron, and he's going to be talking about heat stress and management in manufacturing, along with how to sell heat safety to upper management and get the funds that you may need to get to for some of the resources that you might want access to. So stay tuned for that. We do have one question from Amy here that just came in. She's asking, what is the potential timetable for implementation if it is approved?
Yep. So great question. So let's scroll back to the slide here. So they're proposing, again, this is all proposed. So anything could change between now and the time they actually publish it, but they're proposing a 60-day effective date. So once they publish it into the Federal Register, basically they have 60 days to kind of view what's going on with that standard and view what they've actually finalized within it. And then they're going to give you 90 days from the effective date to comply with that. So it's basically 150 days from the day they put it in the Federal Register, but it's 90 days after the effective date. So, for example, if it was today, you'd have 90. If today was the 60 days after publication, you have 90 days from today to comply with that. But great question.
Okay, we'll give just one more minute to see if there's any last minute questions. But if not, again, thank you, Drew. Really appreciate your time. And also, just to let everyone know, you will receive a recording of this session. So if you took notes and you want to go back, you'll be able to go back and rewatch as many times as you want. So we'll have that coming soon, either at some point during this week or at the beginning of next week, depending on how the rest of the session or summit goes in terms of things that we have to tackle. So keep a lookout for that. You will receive a recording for this. And if there aren't any more questions, Drew, I just want to thank you again. And we'll be jumping right on into Cameron's session, which is starting in just a few minutes. So thank you, everyone. And we'll see you at the next session. Thanks, Drew.
Thanks.